Flanders, Belgium, December of 1914. Snow drifted across the scarred earth like ash from an invisible fire. The trenches were quiet, too quiet for a battlefield. For the first time in months, the night carried no thunder, no screaming shells, only the slow breathing of men who no longer believed dawn would bring anything new. Then, from the German side, a voice began to sing. At first, the sound was faint, almost mistaken for the wind, but it grew clearer, words rolling softly through the fog. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The melody trembled, rising over the parapets of frozen mud. On the British line, Private Frederick Heath looked up from the letter he had been trying to finish. He pressed the pencil against the damp paper until it tore. He whispered to the man beside him, "Listen." The men listened. They heard music. They heard their enemies singing about peace. Frederick's hands shook. He turned to the camera of memory, the thought of home, and murmured, "If you can hear this, wherever you are, tell me, could peace begin like this? Could one song stop a war? If you believe history is more than battles, if you believe in the power of human moments, stay with me until the end. Leave your thoughts below, because what happens tonight will change everything we thought we knew about enemies." He folded the half-written letter and slid it into his breast pocket. The ink was smeared, but the words remained. "Dear Mother, tonight something strange is happening." Across no man's land, a German soldier named Kurt Zemisch adjusted his spectacles with a gloved hand. The frames were bent from frost and dirt. He had once been a school teacher in Leipzig, the kind who taught children to recite poetry by candlelight. Now he was a corporal buried in mud, yet when his comrades started singing, his voice joined them instinctively. He wrote later in his diary that the first verse felt like a prayer spoken by thousands who had forgotten how to pray. Between the lines of wire, the air shimmered. Candle flames appeared one by one along the German trench, like stars trying to return to the sky. Frederick squinted through the periscope, astonished. "They've lit candles," he whispered. "Real candles, right on the parapet." His sergeant cursed softly. "Bloody fools will draw fire," but no shots came. Instead, another sound rose, a British carol, halting at first, then strong. The first Noel, the angels did say. The voices met halfway across the darkness, German and English weaving together in a fragile harmony. For a few minutes, language, uniforms and orders vanished. There was only the song, carried by breath, by longing, by memory. Kurt wrote, "The English sang from their trenches. It was as if the war had stopped itself." Frederick felt his eyes sting. He had seen men die over less distance than the space that now joined them. That night, the sky held both sides without judgment. The moon floated pale and distant, watching men remember they were still men. In the early hours before dawn, the song faded. The frost deepened. Frederick returned to his letter. "Mother, if I don't make it, know that tonight I heard something holy." The enemy sang Silent Night, and for a moment, I believed in Christmas again. He stopped writing when his pencil froze in his fingers. Around him, the trench smelled of wet wool, smoke, and candle wax. Kurt in the opposite trench finished his diary entry with a single line. "Perhaps tomorrow we will shoot again, but tonight we sang." The war paused, not because of generals or treaties, but because exhausted men dared to listen. As the sky paled over Flanders, a faint light touched the wire between them. It was not the flash of a gun, it was morning, and somewhere in that stillness, history waited, holding its breath. The frost never melted inside the trenches. When dawn broke, it simply turned from white to grey. The men stirred, coughing, wiping the sleep and smoke from their faces. The night before still hovered between memory and disbelief. No one dared to speak of it loudly. Frederick sat with his back against the frozen wall, unfolding his letter once more. The paper had stiffened during the night, and a few drops of melted wax had left small amber marks. He smoothed it carefully and added a few lines. He wrote about the song, about the strange quiet that had settled afterward, and about the feeling that someone far away might have felt the same peace at the same hour. Across no man's land, Kurt Zemisch was also writing. His diary was a small notebook wrapped in a piece of cloth to keep it dry. His handwriting was neat, the script of a man used to chalk and blackboards. "My students," he wrote, "would never believe that I once sang a Christmas hymn in the middle of a war. If they ask me one day what it was like, I will tell them that the night was cold, and for a few moments we were all children again." Frederick looked up when he heard movement above him. A fellow soldier, Thomas, was checking the parapet for new shell holes. "Think it'll happen again?" Thomas asked. Frederick shook his head. "No, orders will come soon. They'll tell us to fire again. They always do." The air smelled of damp earth and candle smoke. Somewhere along the line, a German voice called out a greeting. It was soft, uncertain. The British soldiers froze. No one answered. Then another voice, this time in English, drifted back. "Good morning, English. You all right?" The men exchanged glances. It felt unreal. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Kurt wrote that the silence afterward was heavier than gunfire. "We were waiting," he wrote, "for someone to answer, and we were afraid of what might follow." Frederick wanted to reply. He wanted to shout that he was alive, that he had heard the songs and believed, for a heartbeat, that peace was possible. But the sergeant's eyes were on him. The moment passed. Instead, he wrote another letter, this one to a friend named Henry, a man he had joined the army with back in Liverpool. "Henry, the strangest thing has happened. The Germans sang to us. They lit candles on their trench walls, real candles. I felt ashamed to be afraid of them. They were men, cold and hungry, just like us." He folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his coat, and stared at the horizon. The fields beyond were white and empty, scattered with wire and the shapes of broken trees. Nothing moved except the smoke from distant fires. Kurt closed his notebook and rubbed his hands together for warmth. He thought about his wife, about the Christmas tree that would be standing in their small apartment in Leipzig, about the students who would be singing the same songs he had sung last night. He imagined their voices reaching him somehow, traveling across miles of snow and mud. That afternoon, an officer from the British side walked along the trench, his boots sinking into the slush. "Keep your heads down," he said. "We're expecting orders by morning. No more friendly gestures, understood?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The magic of the night had already begun to fade, replaced by the heavy knowledge that war always remembers its purpose. As the light dimmed again, Frederick felt the urge to write one more time. He began a new letter to his mother. "You told me once that even in war, kindness survives. Last night I think I saw what you meant. I wish you could have heard them sing. It was like hearing forgiveness itself." He stopped, looking at the small blue flame of his candle. It flickered against the damp wall, trembling with each breath of wind. Kurt, on the other side, lit his own candle. He did not sing this time. He simply watched the light dance and thought of all the things he could not say out loud. Between the two flames, somewhere in the frozen dark, the world seemed to hold its breath once more. The afternoon light in Flanders was thin, barely enough to see by. The ground between the trenches, no man's land, lay motionless, a strip of frozen mud and tangled wire, where even the wind moved carefully. The quiet that had begun with the singing still lingered, uncertain and fragile, like a truce that no one had agreed upon but no one wished to break. Frederick Heath stood near the parapet, his fingers numb inside his gloves. The letter he had written sat folded against his chest, close to his heartbeat. He found himself glancing toward the German lines more often than he should have. Every few minutes, a flicker of light would catch his eye, small glows that seemed to rise out of the ground. At first he thought they were reflections, perhaps from broken bottles or bits of shrapnel, but as the sun dipped lower, the lights became unmistakable. Candles. Again. One after another, they appeared along the German trench, set on wooden boxes, stuck in bottles, balanced on bayonets. The sight was both eerie and beautiful. They burned steady against the fading daylight, tiny defiant sparks in a landscape built for death. Thomas, the soldier beside him, muttered, "They're doing it again, like last night." Frederick nodded. Maybe they want to finish the song. No one laughed. The idea did not seem absurd anymore. Across the field, Kurt Zemisch watched his comrades place the candles. He had argued quietly with his superior that morning, insisting that lighting them again was not an act of rebellion but of faith. "If we can keep the light," he said, "perhaps we can keep something human." His officer had shrugged. "Do what you will, Zemisch. The cold will kill us sooner than the British." So Kurt helped light the candles. He placed one near the edge of the trench, shielding the flame with his hands. It burned low and steady, its reflection trembling on the surface of his steel helmet. In his diary, he would later write, "The candlelight made us believe that we had power over the darkness, even for a moment." Frederick lifted a periscope to see better. The flickering line of candles seemed endless, stretching left and right until it vanished into the fog. He felt something swell in his chest, an ache that was not fear or anger, but recognition. He turned to Thomas. "Do you suppose they're like us?" Thomas spat into the mud. "Same hunger, same cold, different flag." From the German side came a sound. Laughter. Someone was joking loudly, the words too distant to understand. Then another sound, an English phrase, shouted with a thick accent. "English, you sing again!" Frederick's breath caught. Around him, men looked up, unsure if they had heard correctly. Then, to everyone's astonishment, a few voices from their line answered, cautious but clear. Sing, you start. A cheer rose from the German trench, followed by a melody. It was not Silent Night this time, but something lively, almost a tavern tune. The rhythm carried easily through the cold air. The British soldiers listened, and one of them, a corporal with a rough voice, began to hum along. Soon, more joined in. The two sides were no longer separated by silence but by rhythm, like dancers keeping distance but sharing the same beat. Kurt leaned over the parapet, watching the silhouettes of men he had been ordered to kill. They were laughing now, and the sound of their laughter made him uneasy. If the officers see this, someone whispered beside him, they'll have our heads. Then let them come, Kurt replied softly. Let them see what they've been trying to destroy. For a while, the field became a mirror, each side reflecting the other's humanity back and forth. There was no strategy, no command, only the warmth of shared absurdity in a frozen world. But even as the singing spread, there was tension in the air, a knowledge that this peace could shatter with a single bullet. The candles trembled in the wind. Somewhere to the south, a distant gun fired, the sound echoing like a reminder that this was still war. The singing faltered, then rose again, stronger this time, as if defying the noise. Frederick lowered his periscope and took a deep breath. It feels wrong, he murmured. And yet, it feels right. He wrote another short note on the back of his old letter. They are not monsters, Mother. They have voices like ours. They laugh the same. I do not know what to do with this truth. Night came slowly. The candles still burned, their light faint against the darkness. The soldiers on both sides watched them, as if afraid that looking away would make the moment disappear. Kurt's hand hovered above his rifle, not to fire, but to keep it from freezing to the metal. He whispered to himself in German, words he would later translate, "Peace is not the opposite of war. It is the memory that war cannot erase." Frederick leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Somewhere between the lines, he imagined he could see that memory taking shape, a fragile light suspended over the void, waiting for someone brave enough to reach it. The night that followed was clearer than the one before. A pale moon floated low, spreading its light across the white crust of frost that covered no man's land. The faint glow of candles still dotted both lines, defying the darkness. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall, but a bridge made of sound waiting to be crossed again. Frederick Heath sat on the firing step, his helmet pushed back, hands clasped tightly around a small tin cup of tea that had long gone cold. He could hear a voice singing in the distance. It began softly, hesitant, then steadied into the same melody that had broken the silence the night before. Still Nacht, Heilig Nacht. The tone was different now, slower, fuller, almost reverent. The men around him stopped what they were doing. One muttered, "They're doing it again," singing the same carol. Frederick lifted his head. Then maybe we should answer. No one moved at first. To respond would be madness, maybe even treason. But the sound of that song, it carried something too human to resist. The melody wove through the fog, through the fear, and found the space in every soldier's chest where home still lived. Somewhere farther down the trench, a Scottish voice began humming the first Noel. Others joined, one after another, until two songs, one German, one English, mingled in the frozen air, harmonizing where none should have met. Kurt Zemisch stood on the opposite line, the cold stinging his face. His heart beat fast, not from fear but from awe. He could hear the English voices blending with theirs, rough and imperfect, yet heartbreakingly sincere. He thought of his students, their innocent faces singing in a warm classroom. How far away that world felt now. He leaned on the edge of the parapet and whispered, "Vielleicht hören wir denselben Gott." Perhaps we are hearing the same God. Frederick's sergeant muttered a warning. "If command finds out about this, we'll all be court-martialed." Frederick replied quietly, "If command finds out, maybe they'll remember we're still men." The two songs ended almost together, the last notes rising and fading into the wind. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the soft crackle of frost. Then, from the German side, a shout, "Merry Christmas, English." The British soldiers exchanged glances. One of them laughed nervously. Another shouted back, "Merry Christmas, Fritz." The reply drew laughter and applause from both sides. Someone whistled. Someone else shouted in German, "You no shoot, we no shoot." Frederick felt something break open inside him, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the war began. Hope. He climbed up just high enough to see over the parapet, waving his hand. "Merry Christmas," he called again. Kurt saw the movement and raised his hand in return. The distance between them was less than 100 yards, yet it felt like miles of history were collapsing into that single gesture. "Do you think they'll cross?" someone whispered near Frederick. "Not yet," he said. but they will. Kurt's diary would later read, "It was as if the earth itself wished to breathe again. We were no longer enemies, only men divided by orders." The singing began again, this time together. "O come, all ye faithful." The melody rose strong and full, echoing across the battlefield where bodies had once fallen by the thousands. Every note felt like defiance, every harmony a refusal to surrender to hatred. Even the officers, watching from the rear, could not bring themselves to stop it. One British lieutenant simply removed his cap and bowed his head. "Let them sing," he murmured, "if only for tonight." Frederick looked at the sky, now scattered with stars. For the first time in months, it was beautiful. He thought of his mother, of Christmas dinners and the warmth of a fire. He wondered if she was looking at the same stars, wishing for her son to come home. Across the field, Kurt closed his eyes and whispered a short prayer, not for victory, but for forgiveness. When the final verse ended, silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. Softer, kinder. The guns were still loaded, the war still alive, yet the night itself felt unwilling to let violence back in. Frederick wrote one last line before trying to sleep. "They sang to us, and we sang back. I think we remembered who we are." And somewhere across the white field, a German teacher wrote the same thing in another language. The morning came wrapped in fog thick enough to hide the Sunday. It blurred the lines between earth and sky, between one army and the other. The frost on the ground cracked softly under boots as men shifted, restless, uncertain what the new day would bring. No one fired a shot. Frederick Heath stood near the edge of the trench, peering through the mist. The world looked empty, stripped of color, but he could still see the faint shimmer of candlelight glinting on the wire ahead. The Germans were awake. A murmur rippled along the British line. Someone whispered, "They're waving." Frederick leaned forward and saw them, dark figures moving cautiously beyond their parapet, hands raised, holding nothing but white cloths tied to sticks. The sight sent a shiver through him that was not fear, but disbelief. One of the officers hissed, "Get down, you idiots, it's a trick." But no gunfire came. The Germans did not advance. They stood in the fog, smiling, calling out in broken English, "English, you no shoot, we no shoot." For a long moment, no one answered. Then a voice from the British side, Thomas, reckless as always, shouted back, "We no shoot either." Laughter broke from both lines, light and nervous. The officer shouted again, but his voice sounded small against the vast quiet of the morning. Frederick could feel his heart pounding. He did not wait for orders. He climbed halfway up the frozen wall, keeping one hand on the edge for balance. "What are you doing?" someone hissed. "I just want to see," he said. Across the fog, Kurt Zemisch was doing the same. He had tied a white handkerchief to a stick, his breath forming clouds in the air. He waved it slowly, not as a flag of victory, but as an offering. His comrades followed, stepping forward until they stood fully exposed above the trench line. Frederick hesitated, then raised his hand. His glove was torn, the fingers stiff with cold, but he waved anyway. The movement felt heavy, as if lifting the weight of the entire war. Then something happened that none of them would ever forget. From the German side, one soldier began walking toward the center of no man's land. His rifle stayed behind, his hands high. The fog swallowed him as he moved, then revealed him again, just a young man in a long coat, his face pale with fear and determination. The British soldiers raised their weapons instinctively, but Frederick called out, "Hold fire!" He didn't know if anyone would listen, but no shots were fired. He climbed over the parapet. Mud clung to his boots, freezing around his ankles. The cold bit through his uniform, but his pulse burned hot. He walked slowly, step by step, until he was close enough to see the other man's eyes. They stopped a few feet apart, unsure what came next. The German smiled, first awkward, genuine. He extended his hand. Frederick stared at it, then took it. The handshake was brief, almost mechanical, but it carried a kind of electricity neither man had ever felt. Around them, others began to follow. More soldiers climbed from the trenches, first a few, then dozens, until the fog was filled with shapes moving toward one another. Kurt watched from his side, his breath caught in his throat. "They're meeting," he whispered. "God, they're actually meeting." He too climbed out. The air smelled of earth and smoke and something new, something like hope. When he reached the middle, he saw British soldiers up close for the first time. They were young, mud-covered, their faces hollow from hunger and exhaustion, yet their eyes were alive. One of them offered him a cigarette. Kurt took it, smiling. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin of chocolate, pressing it into the soldier's hand. No one knew what to say. They spoke in fragments, in gestures, in smiles. It was enough. Frederick turned as someone handed him a small silver cross, German workmanship, delicate and worn. For luck, the man said in broken English. Frederick nodded, unsure how to thank him. Kurt bent down and picked up a piece of barbed wire, twisting it into a ring. He handed it to a British corporal who laughed and slipped it onto his finger. Better than the one I gave my girl, the corporal joked. For the first time since the war began, the air was filled with laughter that wasn't cruel, shouts that weren't commands. Frederick looked at the German before him and said quietly, "Maybe tomorrow we'll be ordered to kill each other again." The German's smile faltered. "Ja," he said softly, "but not today." They stood there, surrounded by fog, their breath rising together in the same frozen air. Later, when Frederick returned to the trench, he wrote the words that would survive him. "I shook hands with the enemy today." His hand was warm, mine was trembling, and on the other side, Kurt's diary ended the day with a line that history would one day read aloud. "It took 5 months to destroy the world. It took 5 minutes to remember we were the same." The fog began to lift by noon, revealing the battlefield in a soft grey light. The frozen mud glistened under a thin layer of frost, pocked with footprints from both sides that mingled together without pattern or boundary. The rifles that had defined the morning now lay forgotten, propped against walls of dirt or buried in snow. Frederick Heath could hardly believe what he was seeing. Dozens of British and German soldiers stood openly in no man's land, shaking hands, exchanging names, showing photographs of families and sweethearts. Someone laughed, the kind of laugh that hadn't been heard since the war began, and the sound spread like a ripple, warming the air more than the weak sun ever could. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tin box, dented and streaked with mud. Inside were a few crushed cigarettes and one piece of chocolate he had saved from a care package months ago. He walked toward a group of German soldiers who were passing around a flask and smiled awkwardly. "Trade?" he said. A young German with straw-colored hair nodded eagerly. He handed Frederick the flask and accepted the chocolate as if it were a bar of gold. "Danke," he said. "For my brother, he likes sweet things." Frederick took a sip from the flask and coughed. "Good God, what is that?" "Rum," the German said proudly, and laughed. The others joined in. Nearby, a Scottish soldier was teaching a group of Germans how to roll a proper cigarette. "Not too tight," he said, gesturing. "You want it to breathe like a good woman." The Germans didn't catch every word, but they laughed anyway. One of them mimicked his accent so perfectly that even the Scotsman had to grin. Kurt Zemisch stood among them, notebook in hand, trying to capture the moment without breaking its spell. He had seen enough death to recognize when life was fighting to return. He wrote, "We gave them tobacco. They gave us chocolate. We showed pictures of our families, and for a few hours we belonged to the same one." He was approached by a British corporal carrying a tin cup of steaming tea. "You write a lot," the man said. "I am a teacher," Kurt replied in careful English. "Teacher, eh? My dad was one. Maybe you'd have taught me if I'd been born your side of the line." Kurt smiled. "Maybe you'd have been my best student." The corporal chuckled and raised his cup. "To teachers, then." "To peace," Kurt said, touching his flask to the cup. Around them, the strange festival continued. Someone had found a football, an old leather ball scuffed and patched, and tossed it into the open space. Within minutes, men from both sides were kicking it across the field, shouting, cheering, slipping in the mud. Officers watched from the trenches, too stunned to intervene. Frederick joined in for a moment, chasing the ball, his boots heavy with ice. He fell, laughed, and found himself helped up by a German sergeant who grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "You play bad," the sergeant said, his English broken but friendly. "I'm better at running away," Frederick answered, and both men laughed. The game ended when the ball rolled into a crater filled with frozen water. No one cared. They were too busy talking, sharing food, and comparing the small tokens of their lives, lockets, letters, and bits of home. One German passed around a photo of his wife holding a baby. "Born in May," he said proudly. Frederick showed him a picture of his sister, a nurse in London. They couldn't understand every word, but they didn't need to. The meaning was clear enough. Kurt watched two soldiers, one British and one German, kneel together to bury a body that had lain between the lines for weeks. They marked the spot with a simple cross made of twigs. He wrote, "Even the dead are at rest today." As afternoon turned to evening, the men began to drift back toward their lines. No one gave orders. It simply felt like the right time. Before leaving, Frederick took off one of his gloves and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small brass button from his uniform and handed it to Kurt. "For your students," he said. Kurt accepted it carefully. "I will tell them it came from a man who forgot to hate me." They shook hands again, slower this time, reluctant to let go. The light faded, and with it came the realization that this miracle would not last forever. Still, for that one day, war had lost its voice. When Frederick returned to his trench, Thomas was waiting, eyes wide. "You're mad, you know that? Talking with the enemy?" Frederick smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I've never felt more human." He lit one of the German cigarettes. The taste was harsh, smoky, and warm. It filled his lungs and lingered like a memory he would never want to forget. Across the field, Kurt sat against the frozen earth, eating the last of the chocolate. He chewed slowly, savoring it as if he could hold on to the sweetness forever. He wrote in his diary, "It is strange. I do not feel that we won or lost anything today, only that for a few hours we remembered who we were before the war." The night fell quietly over Flanders, carrying the scent of tobacco and cocoa instead of gunpowder. For once, the stars above looked down on men who were not fighting, but simply living. The afternoon sun lingered low over Flanders, a dull golden disk floating above the mist. The wind had softened. It no longer carried the scream of shells or the bitter tang of gunpowder. Instead, laughter drifted over the field, unbelievable, impossible laughter. It began with something as ordinary as a ball. A Scottish soldier from the Gordon Highlanders had found an old football half buried in the trench, scuffed and leaking air but still whole enough to roll. When he kicked it out onto the field, it bounced once, twice, and came to rest between the two armies. Both sides hesitated. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a German corporal jogged forward, boots crunching the frost, and gave the ball a light kick back. Cheers erupted from both lines. "Come on, lads," shouted someone from the British side. "Let's give them a proper game." Men spilled out of the trenches as if they had been waiting their entire lives for permission. Rifles were left behind, helmets tossed aside. The ground between them, once a graveyard, now became a pitch. Frederick Heath joined the rush, laughing despite himself. His breath came out in clouds, his heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in months, joy without fear. A German sergeant shouted, "Loss! Loss!" and charged toward the ball. Frederick intercepted, slipped, and went sprawling face first into the mud. He looked up to find the sergeant offering him a hand. "You play bad, Englishman," the German said with a grin. Frederick laughed, grasped his hand and got to his feet. "Better at falling than scoring," he replied. The game unfolded with a chaos that defied strategy or sides. Coats were thrown down to mark the goals, and neither team could remember who was supposed to be winning. Someone called for a referee. Another shouted back that there were no rules in no man's land. The laughter grew louder. Kurt Zemisch stood at the edge of the crowd, notebook forgotten in his coat pocket. He couldn't resist joining in. When the ball rolled near him, he kicked it high into the air. It soared, silhouetted against the pale sky, and for a moment every head tilted upward, watching it spin in slow motion like the world itself holding its breath. It landed near a small crater, bounced twice, and disappeared into the snow. A groan of disappointment followed, but soon another ball appeared. Someone had found a bundle of rags tied together with twine. They played on. Even the officers, those who hadn't yet stopped the madness, stood watching from their trenches. One British lieutenant muttered, "God help us, they're playing football with the enemy." Another officer replied quietly, "Maybe God finally is helping us." The laughter carried far across the lines. Men cheered each other's goals, regardless of which side scored. They clapped backs, shared drinks, swapped caps. For a single afternoon, the war lost its purpose. Frederick would later write, "The strangest thing was not that we played, but that we all wanted to lose. No one kept count. The game itself was victory enough." Kurt, flushed and smiling, jotted down notes whenever he caught his breath. "I saw men who yesterday were trying to kill each other fall into each other's arms laughing. Perhaps peace begins like this, with men too tired to remember why they hate." At one point, a German private scored a goal, dropped to his knees and shouted, "Deutschland!" The British players booed, laughing, and one of them grabbed him in a mock tackle. The laughter rolled over the field again, echoing into the fog like music. As the sun began to sink, the shadows stretched long across the frost. Someone shouted that it was time to head back before darkness made the ground too dangerous. The game slowed, and men began to shake hands, breathless, muddy, and grinning like schoolboys caught in the act of happiness. Frederick noticed a German soldier limping slightly and offered his arm. "You all right?" he asked. The man nodded. "Twisted ankle, worth it." He laughed, then added, "When war end, maybe we play again, yes?" Frederick smiled. "Yes, next time without the guns." They both knew that next time would never come, yet neither could bring himself to say it aloud. Kurt watched as the men began to drift back toward their trenches, carrying with them the memory of the laughter and the warmth of shared breath in the freezing air. He wrote one final note for the day. "It is strange. The ground between us is soaked with blood, yet for these few hours it felt like home." As twilight deepened, the field grew still once more. The only marks left behind were footprints and the faint outline of a ball half buried in the snow. The men vanished into the trenches, taking with them the proof that even in the heart of war, peace had lived if only for an afternoon. Frederick sat by the candlelight, his uniform stiff with dried mud, and whispered to himself, "I'll remember this day when all the rest have gone." He closed his eyes, hearing the echo of cheers and laughter fade into the cold. On the German side, Kurt watched the stars return. For the first time since the war began, they didn't seem so far away. As the light of the afternoon faded into the grey-blue hush of evening, the field slowly emptied. The last echoes of laughter drifted away, swallowed by the mist that crept back over Flanders. Men returned to their trenches reluctantly, glancing behind them as though afraid that looking away would erase what they had just lived. Frederick Heath lingered at the edge of no man's land, his boots sunk deep in the frozen mud. The ball lay half-buried near a crater, a mute reminder of the impossible hours they had shared. He stooped to pick it up, brushed the frost from its cracked leather, and held it for a moment before tossing it back toward the German line. A voice called out, "Danke," and he smiled, waving once before turning away. Inside the British trench, the air smelled of wet wool, tobacco, and faint traces of chocolate. Soldiers sat in clusters, talking in low voices, comparing the gifts they had been given: buttons, coins, cigarettes wrapped in newspaper, tiny tokens from strangers who hours ago had been their enemies. Thomas grinned as he showed off a German belt buckle engraved with "Gott mit uns." "Can you believe this?" he said. "A souvenir from a man I nearly shot last week." Frederick smiled faintly. "You didn't shoot him, though. That's what matters." He reached into his coat and unfolded a small photograph, a faded image of his mother and sister standing in front of a garden fence. The edges were worn, the corners softened by months of handling. He stared at it for a long time, then tucked it back carefully and took out his writing kit. "Dear Mother," he began, "I wish you could have seen today. We met the Germans in the open. No guns, no anger. They showed me pictures of their families. One man had a baby girl born in May. I gave him a cigarette, and he gave me chocolate for you. I'll keep it safe until I come home." He paused, then smiled sadly. "I think you would have liked them, Mother. They looked as tired of war as we are." Across the field, Kurt Zemisch was writing too. His candle flickered as he opened his diary. "The English gave me tea," he wrote. "They showed me their families. One young man said he had a sister who was a nurse. I gave him my wife's address, told him that if I do not return, perhaps he will send her this photo." He slipped a small picture between the pages, a photograph of his wife, Elsa, holding their little boy. The child's face was round, smiling, innocent. For a moment, Kurt closed his eyes and imagined his family safe and warm, unaware that across the field another man was writing about them. Later that night, when the sky turned darker and the first stars appeared, a few soldiers from both sides met again near the middle of no man's land. They spoke quietly, trading the last of their tokens before the inevitable orders came. Frederick found Kurt among them. The teacher's spectacles glinted in the candlelight as he smiled. "You again," he said softly. Frederick nodded. "I wanted to thank you for the chocolate." Kurt laughed. "It was very small." "It was enough." Frederick reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "My mother's address," he said. "If I don't make it home, would you?" Kurt hesitated, then took the note and pressed it to his chest. "I will keep it safe," he said. "And if you live, you must do the same for me." He tore a page from his diary, scribbled Elsa's name and address, and handed it over. For a moment, they stood in silence, the fog curling around them like breath. Frederick held out his hand, and Kurt took it. Their handshake was slow, deliberate, almost solemn, an agreement between two men who knew that peace was not written by governments but by gestures like this. Behind them, the murmur of other voices filled the darkness. One soldier played a harmonica, another passed around a bottle. Someone began to hum Auld Lang Syne, and soon the tune spread, soft and uncertain, winding through the cold air like a farewell. Frederick looked toward the German line, where small lights still glimmered in the trenches. He imagined Kurt sitting down, writing again, maybe praying. He took the German's address and tucked it into the same pocket as his mother's photograph. In his notebook, he wrote one line before blowing out the candle. "I have met a man I was told to hate. I think I will remember his face longer than any battle." Across the field, Kurt wrote almost the same words in German. When the lights finally dimmed, the field fell quiet once more. But the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt alive, like something breathing softly beneath the frost, waiting to be remembered. The next morning broke pale and soundless. A thin frost glittered across the wire and frozen mud. The candles from the night before had burned out, leaving behind tiny pools of wax like ghosts of the light that once was. The battlefield looked peaceful, too peaceful. Frederick Heath stirred awake in his dugout, his coat stiff from the cold. For a moment he forgot where he was. He had dreamt of walking through his street at home, of hearing his mother call from the doorway, but the smell of damp soil and burnt kerosene pulled him back. A faint voice outside was calling, "Mail! Incoming mail!" He crawled out, blinking against the grey light. The post had arrived, sacks of letters carried through the frost. The men crowded around as if it were treasure. Some read silently, others smiled through tears. Frederick received nothing. He folded his hands around the pocket that held his mother's photograph and Kurt's address. That was enough. Across the field, in the German trench, Kurt Zemisch was also awake. His breath made little clouds in the air as he wrote in his diary. "It is strange. After all that happened yesterday, the earth feels heavy again. I can hear our officers speaking. They are angry. The British officers were just as uneasy. Word had spread up the line about the fraternization, the songs, the gifts, even the football match. Command was furious. Rumors said that new orders were already on their way. By mid-morning, the stillness began to crack. Far down the trench, a single shot rang out. It echoed like thunder across the frost. Everyone froze. No one knew who had fired. Maybe it was an accident, maybe a command. But the spell was broken. Frederick felt his heart tighten. "It's starting again," someone whispered. The next sound was distant artillery, a slow rhythm at first, then more. The ground trembled faintly beneath their boots. Kurt looked up from his diary as the vibration reached him. "So soon," he wrote. "The peace lasted one night, and now the world remembers what it was built for." Still, no one wanted to move first. Men stared across no man's land, unsure whether to duck or wave. Some did both. Frederick saw a German soldier. He recognized the young man with straw-colored hair who had shared chocolate with him. Their eyes met for an instant before another shell exploded far off to the north, shaking the sky apart. Officers shouted orders. "Back to your posts. Keep your heads down." Frederick hesitated, clutching the small piece of paper with Kurt's address. He didn't want to let go of what they had made. Down the line, a British lieutenant shouted, "Anyone caught talking with the enemy again will face court-martial." A murmur of protest ran through the men, soft but bitter. One soldier muttered, "Aye, they can court-martial the whole bloody line then." Frederick forced himself to write a short note on the back of his last letter. "They told us to forget yesterday, but I don't think I can. For once I saw the world without hate, and it was beautiful." He folded it, tucked it into his breast pocket, and looked out toward the fog. The field that had been filled with laughter and footprints was empty now. The ball was gone. The snow had covered everything again, smoothing out the marks of peace as though it had never happened. Kurt sat against the wall of his trench, staring at the white horizon. Around him, the mood had changed. Officers barked commands. Men cleaned rifles, reloaded ammunition. The sound of war returned slowly, like an old, familiar voice you hoped never to hear again. A young private near Kurt muttered, "Was it all for nothing?" Kurt didn't answer right away. He reached into his coat and touched the folded paper with the English address. "No," he said softly. "It happened. That is enough." By noon, the first shells began to fall closer. Dirt and snow leapt into the air. Frederick ducked as a fragment whistled overhead. The air filled again with the smell of gunpowder, sharp and choking. Thomas shouted, "Orders are in! We're back to the line!" Frederick looked one last time across the field. The German trench was hidden behind smoke, but he imagined Kurt there, doing the same. For a heartbeat, he almost raised his hand to wave, but then another explosion tore through the silence, and instinct forced him down. When the gunfire finally eased, a cold drizzle began to fall, melting the frost, turning the earth to mud once more. The Christmas truce was over. Frederick wrote one final sentence before the ink ran in the damp air. "It lasted less than 2 days, but I think I will carry it all my life." Across the field, Kurt closed his diary and whispered a single line to no one but himself. "The world forgot peace today, but I will remember it for both of us." The new year approached, but in the trenches time had already lost its meaning. Days bled into nights, nights into days, and the frost hardened into something crueler than before. The Christmas truce, that fragile heartbeat of peace, now existed only as a whisper between men who dared to remember. Frederick Heath kept his letters close. The paper had grown soft from the damp, the ink smudged in places, but he read them often, his mother's photograph, his words to her, and the small folded note from Kurt with the address written neatly in German script. Every evening he told himself he would write again, to describe what had happened, to make it real, to make it last. But each time he tried, the words refused to come. The orders were clear now. No more fraternization, no more mercy. Officers walked the lines to ensure discipline. You will fire when commanded, they said. The enemy must not be treated as a friend. Frederick listened in silence, his mind elsewhere on the candles, the laughter, the sound of silent night, still echoing faintly behind his eyes. Across the field, Kurt Zemmisch heard the same warnings. His commander had torn pages from a soldier's diary as punishment, declaring the truce an act of weakness. Kurt kept his own diary hidden now, wrapped in waxed paper, tucked into the lining of his coat. They can forbid peace, he wrote, but they cannot erase it. The war moved on. The weather worsened. Snow turned to sleet, sleet to rain. Mud swallowed the ground once more. Shells screamed overhead, and men huddled deep in the earth. The miracle of December felt like a dream from another life. One night, near the end of January, Frederick's regiment received orders to advance. The ground was frozen solid, the air sharp enough to draw blood with every breath. They moved in silence through the darkness, boots crunching on ice, the dull thud of distant guns marking the rhythm of their fear. Frederick carried his rifle and his letters, tied together with a piece of string. He had thought about leaving them behind, but couldn't. The letters had become his anchor, proof that something human had existed amid all this madness. At dawn, the assault began. Artillery thundered, the air filled with the hiss of shrapnel, the dull impact of mortars. The men climbed over the parapet and ran. Frederick ran with them, his breath tearing in his throat. The ground erupted around him. A shell exploded to his left, throwing mud and fragments into the air. He fell, rolled, and struggled to rise. His hand pressed against his chest, where the letters were. Still there. He kept moving. Another explosion, closer this time. The sound swallowed everything. Later, when the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with men who had fallen face first into the mud. Among them lay a folded piece of paper, half buried, the edges singed. On it were the words, "If I don't make it, please send this to my mother. Tell her I heard them sing." The note never reached home. Weeks later, in the German line, Kurt was repairing a trench wall when he saw a movement in the mud beyond the wire. When the fighting stopped, he went out with a stretcher party. They collected what they could: bodies, equipment, letters that had never been sent. He found one sealed envelope inside a coat pocket, its edges blackened but the writing still legible. English words, smudged yet clear enough to read. Mrs. Heath, Liverpool. He hesitated, his breath caught in his chest. He opened it carefully. Inside, the paper was damp but intact. He read the lines slowly, understanding only fragments, but the meaning was unmistakable. A son writing to his mother about peace, about a night when enemies had become friends. Kurt folded the letter again and placed it inside his diary. He wanted his mother to know, he wrote. Now I will tell her for him. But the months dragged on, and letters grew dangerous. Each soldier's correspondence was censored, inspected for forbidden words. Peace, fraternization, friendship, those were the worst of all. When the war finally ended, Kurt returned home thin, hollow-eyed, carrying the worn diary and one English letter. He tried to send it through official channels, but the address was no longer valid. Cities had changed. Streets had vanished. The letter remained with him for years, kept inside the same book that had once held his diary. He could never throw it away. It was said that, long after the Second Great War had begun, the letter was still there, creased, faded, and fragile, but legible. A message never delivered, from a son who sang with his enemy and found peace for one night in the cold. The war ended, not with triumph, but exhaustion. When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, the world exhaled for the first time in 4 long years. The silence that followed was not peace. It was the sound of everything broken trying to remember how to be whole again. Kurt Zemmisch walked home through a landscape that barely resembled the country he had left. Villages were gone, fields torn to ribbons, trees blackened and split like bones. The teacher who had once known the names of every child in his classroom now passed through towns where no one remembered their own neighbors. His uniform hung loose on him, his face hollow from hunger and sleepless nights. Yet his diary remained pressed close to his chest, along with the letter from the English soldier Frederick Heath, the one he had promised to deliver. When he reached his town in Saxony, he found the school still standing, though its roof was half gone and its windows shattered. The bell was missing, stolen for metal. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, dust hung in the sunlight like a quiet snowfall. He set down his pack on the teacher's desk and took out his diary. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and earth. Between them, the folded English letter still rested, the handwriting faded but still alive. He opened it, reading the words again by the dim light that filtered through the broken window. "Dear Mother, I wish you could have seen today. We met the Germans in the open, no guns, no anger. They showed me pictures of their families. One man had a baby girl born in May. I gave him a cigarette, and he gave me chocolate for you." The words trembled in his hands. He closed the letter gently, whispering, "You did come home in a way." His wife, Elsa, entered quietly behind him. Her hair was streaked with grey, her eyes tired but warm. She held their son, no longer a baby now, but a boy of 7. "You're home," she said softly, afraid to speak louder, as if the sound might break him. Kurt smiled faintly, touching her hand. "Yes, home." That night, after dinner of bread and thin soup, he opened his old classroom ledgers and began writing again, not as a soldier, but as a teacher. He wrote down names, memories, stories. He wrote about the truce, about the singing, about the faces of men who had smiled through frost and fear. When his son asked what he was writing, he said, "A story about the night men remembered they were brothers." The boy nodded, wide-eyed. "Did you see it happen?" Kurt smiled. "Yes, and I want you to know it did, so that when you grow up, you'll know what men can do when they choose kindness over fear." The next morning, he walked into the town square where the church had once stood. In its place was a crater filled with weeds and silence. He stood there for a long time, then reached into his coat and took out the English letter. He didn't know where Liverpool was, not exactly. The maps had changed, and the post no longer trusted foreign letters. But he looked up at the cold blue sky and whispered, "Mrs. Heath, your son kept his promise. He believed in peace, if only for a day." Then, with slow hands, he tore a small corner from the letter and placed it inside the hollow of a broken brick wall like planting a seed. "For the children," he said softly, "so they will remember." Years passed. The school was rebuilt. New children came, learning new alphabets, new flags, new histories. But in Kurt's classroom, one lesson never changed. Every December, on the day before Christmas, he would tell his students the story of the truce, how soldiers once laid down their weapons and sang across the snow. He never mentioned names. He never said which side had begun the song, only that it had happened, and that it could happen again. At the end of each lesson, he would take out a small box and open it. Inside were 2 things, a brass uniform button and a folded piece of paper written in English. He would hold them up and say, "These are from a friend. He showed me that peace is not given, it is chosen." When the bell rang and the children left, Kurt would sit alone for a while, listening to the quiet. Some winters he thought he could still hear it, the faint echo of voices singing Silent Night across the fog. And in those moments, he would close his eyes, press the letter to his heart and whisper, "I remember." By the winter of 1939, the world had forgotten almost everything Kurt Zemisch tried to teach. The bells of war rang again, louder, harsher, and far less innocent. He was an old man now, his hair silver, his eyes heavy with years of watching peace shatter again and again. The children he had once taught were grown, some wearing uniforms, marching beneath flags that promised greatness but carried only the same old grief. Kurt still lived in the same small town in Saxony, though it looked different now, cleaner on the surface, darker beneath. His classroom was gone, replaced by a military office. Yet in his home, inside a small wooden drawer lined with linen, the letter from Frederick Heath still waited, folded neatly, ink fading but alive. He had kept it through hunger, through bombings, through the silent years when even speaking of friendship with an Englishman could bring suspicion. And yet, he never destroyed it. That December, as the war spread across Europe once more, Kurt sat by the fire with his grown son, Heinrich. The young man wore a new uniform now, the eagle and swastika stitched onto his sleeve. He had come to say goodbye before deployment. "Father," he said, "you were in the Great War. Tell me, were we right to fight then?" Kurt looked at him for a long time before answering. "We were told we were. And now?" Heinrich pressed. "They say this time is different. They say Germany must rise again." Kurt's voice was quiet but firm. "Every man who says that believes he's fighting for honor. But I've seen too many honors buried in the mud." He reached for the drawer and took out the old envelope. "Do you know what this is?" His son shook his head. "It's a letter from a British soldier. He died not long after I met him, but once on a Christmas long ago we shared chocolate and sang the same song." He handed the letter to his son. Heinrich hesitated, unsure if he should touch it. The handwriting was delicate, looping, unmistakably foreign. Kurt continued, "He wanted his mother to know that peace is possible. I've kept it all these years, waiting for a time when someone might need to be reminded." Heinrich frowned. "But father, they say peace is weakness." Kurt smiled sadly. "Then I suppose I have been weak for 25 years. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the snow-covered roofs. "You will see things I never wanted you to see. But when you do remember this letter, remember that once, even in the middle of war, men chose to be kind." Heinrich folded the letter carefully and returned it to his father. "I will remember," he said quietly. Months later, the bombs came. Dresden burned, Leipzig crumbled, and the war consumed everything again. Kurt's home was hit one night in 1945. The walls fell, the fire spread, and the town that had once known peace was turned into smoke. When rescuers came days later, they found very little ashes, rubble, fragments of books. But in the ruins of a small wooden drawer, wrapped in a piece of waxed paper blackened at the edges, they found a folded envelope. The ink had blurred, but the words could still be read. "Dear Mother, I wish you could have seen today." The letter was passed from hand to hand, surviving the years as cities rebuilt and empires collapsed. No one knew its exact journey. Some said a soldier found it and kept it as a good luck charm. Others believed it was delivered anonymously to a church archive after the war. What mattered was that it endured. Decades later, in 1968, a British historian cataloguing artifacts in Berlin opened a small, unmarked box. Inside lay a single letter, yellowed and creased, with an inscription in faded ink, found in Saxony, 1945. Origin unknown. Language, English. He read it once, then twice, unable to breathe. It was signed Frederick Heath, December 1914. He traced the address Liverpool. The house no longer existed. The records were gone. But the letter, fragile and scarred, had outlived them all. He placed it under glass, labeling it simply, "Letter from the Christmas Truce." And there, in the still air of the museum, the paper whispered its story once more of songs in the snow, of hands clasped in fog, of men who had once looked across the wire and seen brothers instead of enemies. The museum was quiet in a way few places ever are. It stood on a narrow street in London, where the noise of buses and footsteps dimmed the moment one stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of old paper and dust, a scent that always seemed to slow the heart. In one corner of the first gallery, beneath a pane of softly lit glass, rested an envelope creased, faded, the handwriting uneven but still legible. Visitors rarely stopped at first. They came for the helmets, the rifles, the uniforms. They wanted to see the machines that shaped victory and defeat, not a scrap of paper from a soldier no one remembered. But sometimes, when the light caught it just right, someone would pause. The glass reflected their face beside the letter, and for a moment they would read the words aloud, almost a whisper. "Dear Mother, I wish you could have seen today." The letter had no medals, no glory, no names carved into marble. Yet somehow, it drew people closer. It spoke to something that most monuments forgot, that even in war, there had been a moment of grace. One afternoon, a woman in her 60s stood before the case, reading every line. She wore a wool coat and carried a small notebook. Her name was Margaret Heath. She had come after finding a mention of the letter in a local newspaper. The surname was hers, though she wasn't sure if there was any connection. Her grandfather, she knew, had a brother who'd gone to France and never returned. The family had no grave, only a line in an old Bible. Frederick, missing, 1915. She leaned closer, studying the signature at the bottom of the page. The same hand that had once clutched a rifle, now immortalized in ink. Her throat tightened. It didn't matter if it was truly him. The words were real, and they felt like his. She sat down on a nearby bench and opened her notebook. For a long time she wrote nothing. Then she began to copy the letter word for word. Across the room, a curator approached quietly. "Would you like to hear the story of how it was found?" he asked. She nodded. He told her how it had been discovered in Saxony, inside the remains of a bombed house, how it had been kept safe by a teacher's family for decades, and how no one ever knew the teacher's name until a small tag was found years later in a separate archive. Zemisch, Kurt, schoolmaster. The curator smiled faintly. Two men, one English, one German, connected by this. He gestured toward the glass. No generals, no orders, just one act of kindness that refused to die. Margaret's eyes glistened. "My grandfather used to tell us that people don't disappear if they're remembered," she said softly. Maybe this was his way of coming home. The curator nodded. Perhaps it was. She stood for a while longer, reading the letter again, tracing each word as if memorizing it. Around her, other visitors passed by, children tugging at coats, tourists whispering in different languages, but the letter stayed still, speaking to each of them in silence. In another part of the museum, a small plaque displayed a line from a diary, translated from German. It took 5 months to destroy the world. It took 5 minutes to remember we were the same. Margaret copied that too. When she closed her notebook, she noticed her reflection in the glass, the image of a woman, and beside her the faint outline of an envelope written more than half a century ago. Outside, the winter light faded into rain. The city moved on, unaware that inside a quiet room, a conversation between two long-dead soldiers had just continued without words, without sound, but perfectly alive. That night, when the museum closed, the guard lingered a moment longer near the exhibit. He had seen it 1,000 times, but something about it always made him stop. He glanced at the letter, its ink now the color of tea leaves, and whispered as if speaking to an old friend, "Merry Christmas, lads." The sound was soft, almost lost in the hum of the heating vents, but it felt enough. He turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow of the display case behind. The letter rested under glass, silent but unforgotten, the only thing in the room that truly seemed alive. That night, the rain outside the museum thickened into snow. By dawn, the city lay under a quiet white sheet, muffling every sound. The world looked new again, cleansed, or perhaps simply reminded of what it once was. Inside the museum, the cleaners moved slowly through the dim halls, their footsteps soft against the marble floor. In the glass case, the letter from Frederick Heath rested undisturbed, the faint morning light glinting across its surface. Yet even in stillness, it seemed to breathe. When the museum opened, visitors arrived one by one, some students, some tourists, a few veterans who walked with canes and memories too heavy for words. They lingered by the photographs of the trenches, by the worn boots and helmets, until finally they came to the small display at the corner. Letter from the Christmas Truce, December 1914. Most stayed longer than they expected. Some wiped their eyes without knowing why. A few whispered to their companions, "Can you imagine? They stopped fighting just to sing." Among the visitors that day was a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, holding his grandfather's hand. The man was tall, stooped, his coat adorned with a faded regiment pin. He walked slowly, his breath shallow. When they reached the letter, the boy pressed closer to the glass. "Did that really happen, Grandpa?" he asked. The old man nodded. "Aye, it did." "Did they stop the war after that?" The man smiled, weary but kind. "No, lad, the war went on, but for one night they remembered how to stop hating." The boy stared at the handwriting, the uneven loops and faded ink. "Did you know them?" "No," the grandfather said softly, "but I knew men like them. Every soldier did." He paused, looking down at his grandson. "That's why I wanted to bring you here, to show you that courage isn't only found in fighting." The boy nodded, thoughtful. Then, with a kind of innocent reverence, he whispered, "It's beautiful." The man placed his hand on the glass, just for a second, and the reflection of his trembling fingers merged with the faint outline of the letter. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." Elsewhere in the world, the letter's story continued to ripple outward. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and school projects. Teachers spoke of it every December as a symbol of humanity in the darkest of times. In a classroom in Dresden, a young history teacher, herself unaware that she was the great-granddaughter of Kurt Zemmisch, showed her students a photograph of the very same letter. She spoke of how, even in war, men could choose compassion over cruelty. Her students listened, silent and still, as she read aloud the last lines of Frederick's letter. "I think you would have liked them, Mother. They looked as tired of war as we are." When she finished, she folded her notes and looked at her students. "That's what history forgets," she said softly. "It remembers who fired the last shot, not who refused to shoot at all." After class, one of the students stayed behind. "Miss Zemmisch," he asked, "do you think they were real, the two men?" She smiled. "Every story is real if someone chooses to remember it." That evening, as snow continued to fall, she walked home through the quiet streets, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. In her pocket, she carried a photocopy of the letter, a simple piece of paper, folded and worn from handling. When she reached her apartment, she placed it under a small candle on her desk. The flame flickered gently, its light reflected in the glass frame. She whispered in German, "Danke, Frederick. Danke, Großvater." "Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, grandfather." And somewhere, across the gulf of a century, the echo reached back the sound of laughter in the snow, the soft strain of silent night drifting through the fog. The past and present met in a single heartbeat of memory. The candlelight shimmered against the paper, and for a fleeting second, it seemed as though the ink glowed again alive, defiant, whispering what both men had once known. Peace is fragile, but it is never lost. It is said that on certain winter nights, when the air is still and the frost lies heavy upon the fields of Flanders, you can almost hear it again, the faint sound of singing carried by the wind. Not loud, not ghostly, just human. A melody that has somehow refused to die. The ground where trenches once cut through the earth is now a quiet plain. Wildflowers grow where barbed wire once glistened. The rain has washed away the scars, but beneath the soil lie the traces of boots, of candles, of footprints that met halfway across no man's land. Frederick Heath and Kurt Zemisch are long gone, their bones lost among thousands. But their words, their songs, and the letter that travelled farther than either of them ever could, those remain. On Christmas Eve each year, small groups gather near the remnants of the Ypres trenches. British and German descendants, historians, children, and wanderers stand together in the cold. They light candles, place them on the earth, and wait. No speeches, no flags, just silence. Then, quietly, someone begins to sing. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Another voice joins in from the opposite side, this time in English. Silent night, holy night. Soon the two melodies merge, one language folding into another, the same notes finding each other across a century. Some sing, some weep, and some simply listen. In that moment, there are no armies, no borders, no uniforms, only the sound of men and women remembering what those soldiers discovered on that frozen field so long ago. That peace, however brief, is the most defiant act of all. Among the crowd, a young boy holds his mother's hand. She tells him the story, the one passed from a German teacher to his granddaughter, from a letter to a museum, from a museum to a world still learning to listen. He looks up at her and whispers, "Did they really stop fighting just to sing?" She smiles. Yes, and maybe that's why we still can. As the song rises into the night, the snow begins to fall, soft and silent. It gathers on the candles, on the earth, on the letters and photographs placed gently at the memorial. Somewhere beneath that soil lies a brass button, a barbed wire ring, and the faint imprint of two men shaking hands in the fog. The wind carries the song farther than any gunfire ever did. It drifts over the fields, through the forests, across the channel, and into the cities where no one remembers their names but everyone knows their story. For a moment, just a moment, the world feels still again, and in that silence, as the last note fades into the dark, you can almost hear Frederick's voice, steady and warm, whispering to the mother who never received his letter. They sang to us, and we sang back. I think we remembered who we are. The candlelight flickers once, then steadies. The snow falls heavier, blanketing the earth in a quiet too pure for words. And across the centuries their voices remain echoes of that night, when enemies became brothers, when fear gave way to song, when the world, just for a breath, remembered how to be kind.